one way to do that is through financial incentives. So in theory, financial incentives will help the education sector become a more competitive and attractive field, especially for those people in those areas that are high demand, like math and science and foreign language, where you can go to another sector of the labor market and get paid much more than you would in the education sector. So in that sense, financial incentives helps to recruit and retain qualified and what may be defined as effective teachers, especially if you can go into another sector and get paid more money. And and it could also fill hard to staff positions, again in math and science and foreign language. Hard to staff can also relate to factors such as location and demographics, because as we know, a lot of high poverty and high minority schools have a really hard time attracting teachers and keeping them there once they do attract them. There is also hypothesized that financial incentives are a means to improve and motivate teachers to work harder and to improve their practice. And they're also a way for educators to give greater attention to what they're doing and the bottom line or the output or the results as the private sector is focused on. And that is their performance and how that performance affects student achievement. So overall, financial incentives theoretically are supposed to improve school capacity by improving human capacity.
So another proposition that we found in the literature is that program design matters. What exactly do we mean by that? Well, while there's no consensus among researchers on a prescriptive pay for performance plan or incentives plan, some researchers have identified key features, or they theorize key conditions that really support pay for performance plans, sustainability, or implementation. And so we have here listed the 6 key conditions or features that you see in those programs. The first is that incentives programs that are aligned with a school district's existing goals, existing structures, or norms, those programs are more likely to succeed. And by succeed, we mean it's more likely to be implemented, and those plans' goals are more likely to be realized. A second feature that we see, how well can the school district, what is their capacity in being able to support that program? Do they have the manpower or the human capital to support the different components of that program? And then also, does the school district have enough funds to actually support that program beyond its pilot year, beyond the first year, beyond the second year? A third feature is the salience and the size of the incentive. So does that incentive that's being offered, does it matter? In some surveys, teachers have actually said that they value having more planning time more than having financial stipends. And then in terms of size, how large is this financial incentive? Is it $500? Is it $5,000? Is it $50,000? That really makes a difference. Fourth, educators, first of all, should support the goals of the program, and then in supporting those goals, they need to perceive that they are going to be able to achieve the performance standards that ultimately decides whether they attain that reward or not. Fifth, a program needs to be transparent and fair. I'd say, the players in the game need to know what the rules of the game are from the onset. So teachers need to know how are they part of the program, how are they going to be reviewed for whether they receive the incentives or not, and so forth. And then finally, stakeholder participation. Teachers or other educators in schools are going to be part of the program. They also need to be part of the group of people who are going to work on the program design and the implementation. The third proposition that we find from our literature is that pay incentives don't easily translate to the education field. So Clarissa briefly talked about how a lot of these ideas are being transplanted from the private sector into the field of education. But there are 2 main reasons why it doesn't easily translate. The first is the nature of teaching. Teaching is complex, it's multidimensional work. And so some have argued that incentives have the potential to really undercut the collaborative ventures that distort behavior within teachers, because they're only being rewarded for certain behaviors within a program. And then second, there's challenges in measurement and evaluation. We're not at a point where we can really tease out and pinpoint an individual's teacher's impact, like exact impact on individual students' academic achievement. And also in terms of teacher evaluation, unfortunately it's a process that's still, it's inaccurate sometimes, and it's not really able to capture all the things that teachers do, and nor does it sometimes acknowledge the validity of different pedagogical approaches used by teachers. And somebody else is now going to talk about some of our key findings from the measurement literature.
Okay, so we look at both theoretical and empirical work that was being done on measurement issues. And one of the theoretical pieces that we focused on was the framework for measurement of performance. In this context, we looked at the Danielson framework because that's what Georgia County will be using to evaluate teachers participating in the FIRST program. The Danielson framework is based on prior work, specifically Malen and Hunter's clinical supervision model. And the other framework that we were looking at was the Interstate School Leaders Licensure Consortium Standard, which is for principals. These were developed using research on productive schools in districts. And we also looked at theoretical work on value-added and growth models, which measure teacher and school effectiveness using student outcomes. So we found overall that the empirical work, there was a limited amount of empirical evidence. With regard to the Danielson framework, there were relatively few empirical pieces, and most of it was coming from a single source, CPRI, and regarding the ISLIC standard and principal evaluation in general, there's just really very little research out there. Principal evaluation tends to vary a lot depending on what locality you're in. And with regard to the value-added and growth model, there's, again, a limited empirical base. Partly this is because most states and school districts don't really have the data systems in place to do value-added models, and also because one of the better-known value-added models is proprietary in nature, and the researchers who developed it have done some research themselves, but haven't always provided the specifications of the model to other researchers who would be able to validate it. Some of the findings from the literature, evaluate according to their focus on input and output. The measures that I was talking about before, the Danielson framework and the ISLIC standards are both examples of input measures. They measure, how well the teacher is performing in the classroom according to the framework, or how well the principal is measuring up to the standard. And the value-added and growth models measure output. They measure student outcomes specifically. There's little empirical evidence to support the validity of these measures, and what we mean by validity is, with regard to the Danielson framework, is there a relationship between how well a teacher performs according to the Danielson framework and whether or not his or her students are performing well in school. And there's some studies that show a correlation, but it's a very tenuous basis of research. And with the ISLIC standards, we found something similar. There's at least one study that suggests that there's a correlation between a principal's performance on the ISLIC standard and high achieving schools. But again, just very little research there to support that. The empirical evidence on value-added and growth models, some researchers have cautioned against using value-added models for high-stakes accountability because of some of the complications with the models, and they may not be precise enough to estimate the impact of a teacher, as LG was saying before. To date, there's no empirical evidence to show the effectiveness of the measures at fostering improvements in instructionally and in school improvement. So there's nothing that links, using the Danielson framework to getting better student outcomes in the end, or using the standards, the ISLIC standards, to getting better outcomes in the end, or using the value-added model to find better teachers, or to determine whether or not teachers are effective, whether or not that would eventually improve instruction. There's just no empirical evidence out there to show that right now. And in general, the evaluation of teacher and principals is still a very highly contested area.
As with the other streams of literature, we found patterns as we looked at literature around paper performance program design and looking at their evidence of effectiveness. So one of the things we found is that in the design of programs, that literature was mostly anecdotal and descriptive. And where we found our empirical data is when we looked at evidence of effectiveness. And so we sort of found two categories of literature related to evidence of effectiveness. And one of those was related to implementation of paper performance plans. We found empirical studies looking at how systems or districts were implementing pay for performance. And then we found another category of literature that really looked at the outcomes of those pay for performance programs. Included in the implementation studies, we found a lot of research on teacher perceptions of how the programs are being implemented. And Amy and I are going to kind of tag team you. She'll share with you some findings on program design, and then I'll come back and share some findings on effectiveness.